My name is Evelyn, and I never thought I'd be sitting here telling you this story, my heart still trembling from the weight of it all. It was just last spring at my granddaughter's engagement party when everything I'd held dear crumbled in a single moment. I was 68 years old, a widow for nearly a decade, and I'd spent my life pouring love into my family, my son Thomas, his wife Laura, and their daughter Sophie. I thought love was enough to bind us, that my sacrifices would mean something. But that night, as the fairy lights twinkled and laughter filled their sprawling backyard, I learned how wrong I'd been. I'd arrived early, my hands clutching a carefully wrapped gift, a silver locket that had belonged to my mother engraved with tiny roses. I'd saved it for Sophie, imagining the moment she'd open it, her eyes lighting up the way they used to when she was a little girl sitting on my lap listening to stories about her grandfather. The party was at Thomas and Laura's new home, a place I'd helped them afford with years of quiet support. Dipping into savings, skipping my own comforts, even selling a small plot of land my late husband James and I had once dreamed of retiring on. I didn't mind. It was for family, for their future. That's what you do when you love someone, isn't it? You give even when it hurts. The evening started warmly enough. I wore my best dress, a deep blue one James always loved, and pinned my hair up the way I used to when I felt confident. I moved through the crowd, smiling, nodding, offering hugs to relatives I hadn't seen in years. But there was a distance in their eyes, a polite chill I couldn't quite place. Laura was busy flitting between guests, her laughter sharp and bright. Thomas barely looked my way, his attention on Sophie's fiancé, a young man with a loud voice and a handshake that felt like a performance. Sophie herself was radiant, her white dress catching the light, but she only gave me a quick peck on the cheek before vanishing into the crowd. I told myself they were busy, that hosting a party this grand was overwhelming. I sipped my lemonade, found a quiet corner, and waited for a moment to feel needed. That moment never came. Instead, I overheard the conversation that broke me. I'd stepped into the kitchen to refill my glass, the chatter of the party muffled behind the swinging door. Sophie's voice, light and careless, floated from the pantry where she stood with a few of her friends. "Grandma's here because we had to invite her," she said, her tone dripping with something between pity and amusement. "It's not like she has anywhere else to go. We only did it to be polite." Laughter followed, sharp and slicing like glass shattering in my chest. One of her friends murmured something I couldn't catch, and Sophie giggled. "Oh, please, she's just there, always hanging on like she thinks we owe her something." I froze my hand, trembling around the pitcher. The room tilted the air too thick to breathe. I wanted to believe I'd misheard, that my Sophie, the girl I'd rocked to sleep, whose college fund I'd built with every spare dollar, hadn't said those words. But the laughter kept echoing, and I knew. I knew they saw me as a burden, a relic to be tolerated. My son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, they'd all agreed in their own ways that I was an obligation, not a treasure. The locket in my purse felt heavy, foolish, a symbol of a love they didn't want. I don't remember deciding to leave. My feet moved before my heart could catch up. I set the pitcher down, slipped out the back door, and walked to my car, the night air cool against my burning cheeks. No one noticed. No one followed. The party went on without me, the music and laughter fading as I drove away, tears blurring the road ahead. I didn't go home right away. I couldn't face the silence of my little apartment, the walls lined with photos of a family that no longer saw me. Instead, I drove to the lake, the one James and I used to visit when life felt too heavy. I sat on a bench staring at the water and let the hurt pour out. I thought of every sacrifice. The nights I'd stayed up sewing costumes for Thomas's school plays, the years I'd worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat after James's illness took him. The trust fund I'd built for Sophie, carefully tended with the last of our savings, meant to give her a future I never had. I'd given them everything, and in return, they'd given me pity. "We only invited you to be polite." Those words carved themselves into me deeper than any wound I'd ever known. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was hollow like a tree stripped of its leaves, standing alone in a storm. But somewhere in that hollowness, a spark flickered. I don't know if it was James's voice in my memory or my own stubborn heart, but I heard it. "You are enough, Evelyn. You always have been." I looked at the locket still in my purse and made a choice. I wouldn't beg for their love. I wouldn't shrink to fit their indifference. I'd given them my heart, but I wouldn't give them my dignity. That night, under the stars, I decided to rewrite the story they thought they knew. They'd invited me out of politeness, but I'd leave with something far greater myself. The next morning, I called my lawyer. It was a small act, one they'd never notice, but it felt like lifting a mountain. I told him I wanted to review the trust fund, the one I'd set up for Sophie years ago. He was kind, his voice steady, but I could hear the question he didn't ask, "Are you sure I was?" For the first time in years, I was sure of something. I didn't know what I'd do with the money, not yet, but I knew it wouldn't go to someone who saw me as an obligation. I hung up the phone and felt a tremor of strength like a seed breaking through soil. It was the first step, and it was mine. I spent the next few days in a kind of fog, moving through my routines, but seeing everything differently. The apartment I'd always thought of as temporary felt like a sanctuary, now a place where I could be Evelyn, not just grandma or mom. I started small, rearranging the furniture, pulling out old photo albums, playing the music James and I used to dance to. I even put on that blue dress again, not for anyone else, but for me. I stood in front of the mirror and saw a woman who'd survived loss, betrayal, and time itself. I wasn't invisible, not to myself. The family didn't call, not Thomas, not Laura, not Sophie. I don't know if they even realized I'd left the party early. That silence was its own kind of answer, and it hurt, but it also freed me. I didn't have to wait for their approval anymore. I didn't have to prove my worth to people who couldn't see it. I started thinking about James, about the dreams we'd had before life got in the way. He'd always wanted to build something lasting, something that helped people. A scholarship maybe, or a community center. We'd talked about it, but there was never enough money, never enough time. Now I had both. I went to the bank, my hands steady as I asked for the paperwork. The trust fund was substantial years of careful saving investments James and I had made when we were young and hopeful. It was meant for Sophie, but it was still mine to give. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to hurt them. I just wanted to honor the love James and I had built, the kind of love that doesn't demand gratitude, but deserves respect. I started researching quietly, carefully. There was a local organization that helped women like me, older, overlooked, starting over. They needed a new building, a place for classes, counseling, community. I could see it in my mind, a place where no one would feel like a burden. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. This was my secret. My strength growing in the dark. But I felt it every day like a fire kindling inside me. I was Evelyn, and I was enough. And when the time came, they'd see it too, not because I demanded it, but because I lived it. The days after that decision felt like waking up from a long, heavy sleep. I was still hurting, don't get me wrong. The ache of Sophie's words, "We only invited you to be polite," clung to me like damp cloth, chilling my bones, even in the warmth of my apartment. But there was something else now, a pulse of purpose I hadn't felt since James was alive. I was 68, and for the first time in years, I was choosing myself. Not in a loud, defiant way, but quietly, like planting a seed you know will grow, even if no one else sees it yet. I started spending mornings at the kitchen table, a cup of tea, steaming beside me, poring over the paperwork for the trust fund. It was strange seeing those numbers on the page, decades of sacrifice distilled into black ink. James and I had built it together, scrimping, saving, dreaming of a legacy for our family. I'd always pictured Sophie's face when she received it, her eyes wide with gratitude, maybe even a hug that felt like the old days. But that dream was gone, replaced by a truth I couldn't unsee. My family didn't value me, not the way I'd valued them. The trust fund wasn't theirs by right. It was mine to give, and I'd give it where it would matter. The organization I'd found, the Women's Haven, kept pulling at me. I'd stumbled across their pamphlet at the library tucked between books on gardening and grief. It was a small nonprofit run by a woman named Ruth, who'd turned her own pain into a lifeline for others. They offered classes for women starting over sewing, bookkeeping, even just a place to talk without judgment. Their building was crumbling, though a rented space with leaking pipes and peeling paint. I called Ruth one afternoon, my voice shaky but determined. I'd like to help, I said, not mentioning the trust fund yet. Maybe donate something. She was kind, her voice warm like a quilt, and invited me to visit. That was my first step into a world I hadn't known I needed. The Haven was on the edge of town, a squat brick building with mismatched chairs and a coffee pot that never seemed to stop brewing. I walked in, clutching my purse like a shield, expecting to feel out of place. But the women there, some my age, some younger, all carrying their own invisible wounds, greeted me like I belonged. Ruth, with her silver hair and eyes that saw right through you, took my hand and said, "You're here. That's enough." I almost cried right then, not because I was sad, but because someone saw me. Not Evelyn, the grandmother, the widow, the burden, just Evelyn. I started volunteering small things at first. I'd bring muffins I baked at home or help sort donations. I listened to the women's stories, divorces, lost jobs, children who'd turned away. Each one felt like a mirror reflecting pieces of my own pain. There was Maria, 72, whose son hadn't spoken to her in years. Linda, 55, who'd been laughed at by her in-laws for wanting to go back to school. We didn't fix each other, but we held space, and that was enough to start healing. I found myself laughing again, not the polite chuckle I'd used at family gatherings, but a real laugh, one that shook my shoulders and made my eyes crinkle. At home, I kept working on my plan. I met with my lawyer again, a man named Mr. Grayson, who'd known James and me for years. He had a gentle way about him, never rushing me, even when I fumbled through my words. "I want to redirect the trust fund," I told him, my voice steadier now. "Not to Sophie, but to something else, a place that helps women like me." I told him about the Women's Haven, about the building they needed, the lives they could change. He nodded his pen, moving across his notepad, and said, "This is big, Evelyn. It's yours to do, but it'll ripple." You sure? I looked at him, at the photo of James on my keychain, and said, "I've never been surer." The process wasn't simple. There were forms, meetings, questions about taxes and legalities. I didn't understand all of it, but I learned piece by piece. I'd sit up late reading, making notes, feeling like a student again. It reminded me of when James and I were young, planning our first home, dreaming up a life. This was different, but it felt just as alive. I was building something not for applause, but for meaning. I didn't tell my family. They hadn't called, hadn't checked on me since the engagement party. Their silence was loud, but it didn't stop me. It pushed me. One afternoon, while sorting clothes at the Haven, I met a woman named Diane. She was 62 with a soft Southern accent and hands that trembled when she spoke about her daughter, who'd cut her off after a fight over money. I gave her everything Diane said, her eyes wet. And now I'm nothing to her. I took her hand, my own voice thick, and said, "You're not nothing. You're here, and that's something." We sat there, two strangers holding each other's pain, and I felt a shift inside me. I wasn't just healing for myself anymore. I was healing for women like Diane, like Maria, like all of us who'd been told we were too old, too quiet, too much. I started wearing James's old watch, a heavy silver thing he'd loved. It ticked softly on my wrist, a reminder of time his, mine, ours. I'd stopped wearing it after he died, thinking it belonged to the past. But now it felt right. It wasn't about clinging to him. It was about carrying him forward. I wore it to the Haven, to meetings with Mr. Grayson, to the grocery store. People noticed, commented on its shine, and I'd smile, saying, "It was my husband's. It keeps me steady." And it did. It reminded me that love, real love, doesn't fade even when others turn away. I also started writing letters not to my family but to myself. I'd sit by the window, the evening light soft on the page, and write what I wished I could say. Dear Evelyn, you are not invisible. You are not a burden. You are a woman who loved deeply and deserves to be loved back. Some nights I'd cry as I wrote the ink smudging under my fingers. Other nights I'd smile proud of the woman I was becoming. I didn't send the letters, didn't need to. They were for me a way to stitch myself back together. The trust fund was almost ready to transfer. Mr. Grayson had worked out the details, a donation to the Women's Haven, enough to buy a new building fund, programs, create a scholarship in James's name. It felt right, like closing a circle. I pictured the women who'd walk through those doors, finding what I'd found a place to belong. I didn't need Sophie's gratitude or Thomas's approval or Laura's polite smiles. I needed this for me, for James, for every woman who'd ever felt discarded. One evening, Ruth called me to the Haven for a surprise. When I arrived, the women had gathered, their faces glowing in the dim light of candles they'd set up on a table. There was a cake, lopsided but homemade, with "Thank you, Evelyn" written in blue icing. Ruth took my hand and said, "We know you're doing something big for us. We don't know what, but we feel it. You're one of us." I stood there, my throat tight, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. I was part of something, not because I'd given money, but because I'd given myself. That night, driving home, I felt James's watch tick against my wrist, and I smiled. The hurt was still there, but it wasn't all of me anymore. I was Evelyn, and I was building something new. Not out of anger, but out of love for myself, for the women at the Haven, for the life I still had left to live. I didn't know what my family would say when they found out, and for the first time, I didn't care. I was enough. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet revolution, one no one else could see but me. I'd wake each morning with a purpose that wasn't tied to pleasing my family or proving my worth to them. It was mine, rooted deep in my bones, like the oak tree James and I planted in our backyard decades ago, still standing even after storms tried to tear it down. I was 68, and I was learning what it meant to live for myself, not out of selfishness, but out of a fierce, tender need to honor the woman I'd always been, even when others couldn't see her. The Women's Haven became my second home. I'd show up most days, my purse stuffed with recipes or old magazines to share and lose myself in the hum of it, all the clatter of sewing machines, the murmur of conversations, the laughter that spilled out when someone told a story. I wasn't just volunteering anymore. I was part of something alive, something growing. Ruth started asking for my advice not out of pity, but because she trusted me. "Evelyn, you've got a head for numbers," she'd say, handing me a budget sheet. "Help me make sense of this." I'd blush, remembering how I'd balanced our family's books when James was sick, stretching every dollar like it was a miracle. I didn't know I still had that in me, but there it was, sharp and steady. I started teaching a class too, just a small one on knitting. I hadn't picked up needles in years, not since Sophie was little, and I'd made her a lumpy scarf she wore proudly until she outgrew it. The women in the class were patient, their hands fumbling like mine used to, and we'd laugh over dropped stitches and tangled yarn. One woman, Clara, who was 70 and had lost her husband to cancer, like I had said, "You make this feel like home, Evelyn." Her words settled into me warm and heavy like a blanket on a winter night. I wasn't replacing my family, but I was building a new one, stitch by stitch. At home, I kept moving forward with the trust fund. Mr. Grayson called me every few days, his voice calm, as he walked me through the final steps. The donation to the Women's Haven was nearly complete, a sum that would not only buy a new building, but fund programs for years to come. We named it the James Hartley Fund after my husband because it felt like he was part of this, his dreams woven into mine. I could almost hear his voice, that low, gentle rumble saying, "You're doing it, Evie. You're making it real." I didn't need a big ceremony or a plaque with my name on it. I just needed to know it would matter, that it would give women like me a place to stand tall. I started noticing changes in myself, small but undeniable. I'd walk a little straighter, my shoulders back James's watch, glinting on my wrist. I bought a new coat, a deep green one, that made me feel alive, not like the faded gray one I'd worn for years because it was practical. I even tried cooking new recipes, things I'd never made for Thomas or Sophie because they'd turn up their noses. Spicy curries, tangy lemon tarts, dishes that filled my apartment with smells that felt like adventure. I'd eat at the table, not the couch, and light a candle just for me. It wasn't about showing off or proving anything. It was about claiming my life piece by piece. My family still hadn't reached out. Not a call, not a text, not even a casual, "How are you?" from Thomas. I'd see Laura's posts on social media, pictures of Sophie's engagement party, her dress glowing under the lights, everyone smiling like nothing was wrong. I wasn't in any of the photos. It stung, but I didn't let it pull me under. I'd spent too many years waiting for them to see me, to need me. Now I was seeing myself, and that was enough. One afternoon while I was at the Haven, Ruth pulled me aside. Her eyes were bright, almost mischievous. "Evelyn, we got a call from a reporter," she said. "They heard about the donation, not the details, but enough to know something big's happening. They want to do a story." My stomach twisted. I hadn't done this for attention, and the thought of my name in a newspaper felt too loud, too exposed. "I don't know, Ruth," I said, my fingers tightening around my coffee mug. "This isn't about me." She squeezed my arm, her voice soft but firm. "It's about all of us. You're giving us a voice, Evelyn. Let people hear it." I thought about it for days, pacing my apartment, talking to James's watch like it could answer me. I didn't want my family to find out this way through some article or gossip, but I also didn't want to hide anymore. I'd spent too long shrinking, making myself small so they could feel big. I called Ruth back and said, "Okay, but keep my name out of it if you can. Call it the James Hartley Fund. That's what matters." She agreed, and I felt a weight lift, like I'd set down a burden I didn't know I was carrying. The reporter came to the Haven a week later, a young woman with kind eyes and a notebook full of questions. I stayed in the background, helping with coffee listening, as Ruth and the others talked about what the new building would mean. The women spoke with such fire about second chances, about being seen, about not letting age or loss define them. I felt proud not of myself, but of them, of us. When the article came out, it was beautiful, full of heart, and my name wasn't mentioned. But I saw James's name in print, and I cried not from sadness, but from a joy so deep it felt like it belonged to both of us. I started doing more at home, too. I cleared out the spare room, the one I'd kept as a shrine to Thomas, and Sophie, old toys, photos, report cards. I didn't throw anything away, but I boxed it up gently, like saying goodbye to a friend you've outgrown. I turned the room into a space for me, a desk for my letters, a chair for reading, a small easel for painting. Something I hadn't done since I was a girl. My first painting was terrible, all muddy colors and crooked lines. But I laughed at it, hung it on the wall, and called it Beginnings. It was mine, and that was enough. I also started walking by the lake again, the one where I'd gone the night of the engagement party. I'd bring a thermos of tea and sit on that same bench, watching the water ripple under the sun. Sometimes I'd talk to James, not out loud, but in my heart. "I'm doing this for us." I'd tell him. For every woman who feels like I did that night. Other times, I'd just sit, letting the wind carry away the last of my hurt. I wasn't angry at my family anymore. I was sad for them, for what they'd lost by pushing me away. But I wasn't waiting for them to change. One evening, while I was knitting at the Haven, Clara, the woman from my class, gave me a gift. It was a small hand-stitched bookmark with my initials EH embroidered in blue thread. "You've given us so much," she said, her voice trembling. "This is just a little thank you." I held it, my eyes burning, and hugged her, feeling the strength of her thin arms around me. That bookmark went into every book I read, a reminder that I was part of something bigger than my pain. The trust fund transfer was finalized that same week. Mr. Grayson called to confirm, his voice warm with something like pride. "It's done, Evelyn," he said. "The James Hartley Fund is official. The Haven will have their building by next spring." I thanked him, my voice steady, and hung up. I stood in my kitchen, James's watch ticking softly, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I'd done it not for revenge, not for applause, but for love. For James, for the women at the Haven, for myself. I knew the time was coming when my family would find out. The article, the donation, the trust fund, it wouldn't stay quiet forever. I wasn't afraid not anymore. I was ready not to fight, but to stand in my truth. I was Evelyn, and I was enough. Whatever came next, I'd face it with my head high, my heart full, and my life my own. The air felt different after the trust fund was finalized, like the first crisp morning after a long, heavy summer. I was 68, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't carrying the weight of my family's expectations or their indifference. The James Hartley Fund was real, a living thing that would grow beyond me, and that knowledge settled into my heart like a warm ember. I'd done something lasting, not for applause, but for the women who'd walk through the Haven's doors long after I was gone. Yet even with that peace, I knew the quiet wouldn't last. My family would find out, and I'd have to face them. Not with anger, but with the strength I'd been building piece by careful piece. I kept going to the Women's Haven, where the women were buzzing with plans for the new building. Ruth had sketches spread across a table, her hands waving as she described classrooms, a garden, a quiet room for counseling. I'd sit nearby knitting or sorting supplies, listening to their dreams take shape. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling, not because anything was funny, but because I was part of this. Me, Evelyn, who'd spent years feeling like a shadow in her own family. The women didn't know the full scope of my donation. Ruth had kept my name out of it as I'd asked, but they'd hug me or squeeze my hand, their eyes saying what words didn't. It was enough. At home, I kept nurturing the small changes I'd started. I painted more of my canvases, still messy, but bolder splashes of red and gold that felt like my heart spilling onto the page. I'd play music, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, the songs James and I danced to in our tiny kitchen when we were young. I'd sway alone in my living room, James's watch heavy on my wrist, and feel him with me not as a ghost, but as a warmth, a reminder that love doesn't die even if people turn away. I started writing more letters to myself too, not just about pain, but about hope. Dear Evelyn, you are building a life that shines. Keep going. I'd tuck them into a wooden box under my bed, a treasure I didn't need to share. I also started taking care of my body in ways I hadn't in years. Not out of vanity, but because I wanted to feel strong. I'd walk by the lake every morning, my green coat bright against the gray dawn, breathing deeply as the water lapped the shore. I joined a gentle yoga class at the Haven, giggling with Clara and the others as we wobbled through poses. My knees creaked, my back ached, but I felt alive, my body a partner in this new chapter, not a burden to be ignored. I even changed my hair, trimming it shorter, letting the silver strands catch the light. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who'd survived, not one who'd been defeated. My family's silence stretched on a void that no longer swallowed me. I'd stopped checking my phone for messages, stopped hoping for a call from Thomas or a text from Sophie. Laura's social media posts kept coming. Sophie's wedding plans, Thomas's promotion, their perfect life unfolding without me. I didn't unfollow them. I just stopped looking. Their world wasn't mine anymore. Mine was here, in the Haven, in my paintings, in the life I was building. I felt sad for them, for what they'd lost by pushing me away, but I didn't need their regret to move forward. Then one afternoon, the quiet broke. I was at the Haven helping Ruth organize a fundraiser when my phone rang. It was Thomas. My heart stuttered, not with hope, but with a strange calm like the moment before a storm. I stepped outside the autumn air, sharp, and answered. "Mom," he said, his voice tight. "We need to talk. Why didn't you tell us about the trust fund?" I froze my fingers tightening around the phone. The article about the Haven must have spread, or maybe Mr. Grayson's office had let something slip. Either way, they knew. I could hear Laura in the background, her voice sharp, and Sophie's softer but insistent. They were all there, a chorus of accusation. Sophie's been counting on that money. Thomas said his words clipped. You can't just give it away without talking to us. That's not fair. Fair. The word landed like a stone in my chest, heavy with irony. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream that fairness hadn't been part of their vocabulary when Sophie said, "We only invited you to be polite." But I didn't. I took a breath, my voice steady, and said, "Thomas, it was my money to give. I chose where it would do the most good." There was a pause, then a flurry of voices, Laura's rising. Sophie's breaking into a sob. Thomas said, "We're coming over. Tonight." And he hung up. I stood there, the phone cold in my hand, the world tilting just a little. I wasn't afraid, not exactly, but I felt the weight of what was coming. They'd want answers, apologies, maybe even the money itself. I went back inside, my hands trembling as I poured coffee for Ruth. She noticed her eyes narrowing. "Evelyn, you okay?" I told her everything, the call, the trust fund, the family I hadn't seen since the engagement party. She listened, her face soft but fierce, and said, "You don't owe them anything, Evelyn. Not a dime, not an explanation. You've built something beautiful. Stand in that." I nodded, her words anchoring me, but my stomach churned as I drove home. They arrived that evening, all three of them, Thomas, Laura, Sophie. I'd set out tea and cookies, not because I wanted to play hostess, but because it gave my hands something to do. They sat in my living room, their faces a mix of anger and discomfort, like they were strangers in a place they'd once called home. Thomas spoke first, his voice measured but sharp. "Mom, we're family. You can't just cut us out like this. That trust fund was for Sophie's future, her wedding, her house. You didn't even ask us." Laura chimed in, her eyes flashing. "It's selfish, Evelyn. You're punishing us for no reason." Sophie just sat there, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes red but silent. I looked at them, my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, and felt a strange calm. I didn't owe them the trust fund, but I owed myself the truth. "I heard you at the engagement party." I said, my voice quiet but clear. "Sophie, you said you only invited me to be polite, that I was just there hanging on. You laughed, all of you." Sophie's face crumpled, her mouth opening, but I kept going. "I've given you everything, my time, my money, my heart, and you made me feel like a burden. I didn't give the trust fund away to hurt you. I gave it to women who needed it, women who see me, who value me. I chose to honor myself and your father's memory." The room was silent, the air thick with shock. Thomas's jaw tightened. Laura's eyes widened, and Sophie started to cry, her voice breaking. "Grandma, I didn't mean it. I was just... I don't know. I'm sorry." I looked at her, my heart aching but firm. "I believe you're sorry now, Sophie. But that night you meant it, and I had to choose what to do with that pain." Thomas leaned forward, his voice softer now. "Mom, we didn't know you felt like this. Why didn't you say something?" I smiled, a small, sad smile. "I shouldn't have to beg you to see me, Thomas. I'm your mother." They didn't stay long after that. Laura tried to argue, but her words felt hollow. Thomas promised to call, his voice heavy with something like regret. Sophie hugged me, her tears soaking my shoulder, but I didn't melt into her the way I once would have. I let them go, closing the door softly behind them. I stood in my quiet apartment, James's watch ticking, and felt neither triumph nor defeat, just clarity. I'd spoken my truth, and it was enough. The next day, I went to the Haven. My heart still raw but lighter. Ruth didn't ask about the visit. She just handed me a skein of yarn and said, "Knit with us." I did, my needles clicking alongside Clara's and Maria's, their laughter pulling me back to myself. I knew my family wasn't done with me. There'd be more talks, more tears, maybe even more accusations. But I wasn't afraid. I was Evelyn, and I'd built something they couldn't take away. Not the trust fund, not my dignity, not the woman I'd become. The days after my family's visit were like the quiet after a thunderstorm, still heavy, but with a clarity that made everything sharper. I was 68, and I'd faced my son, my daughter-in-law, and my granddaughter not with the fire of anger, but with the steady glow of truth. I'd told them how their words had cut me, how Sophie's laugh at the engagement party. "We only invited you to be polite," had shattered something I'd spent years building. I didn't yell, didn't beg for their remorse. I just stood in my truth, and that was enough to shift the air between us. They left my apartment that night, their faces a mix of shock and shame, and I closed the door with a calm I hadn't known I possessed. I didn't hear from them for a while after that. Thomas didn't call Laura, didn't text, and Sophie's apologies, tearful as they'd been, didn't turn into action. I wasn't surprised. Real change takes time, and I wasn't sure they were ready to face what they'd done. I didn't wait for them, though. I'd spent too many years holding my breath, hoping they'd see me, need me, love me the way I'd loved them. Now I was breathing for myself, and it felt like coming up for air after being underwater too long. The Women's Haven was my anchor. I'd go there most mornings, my green coat bright against the autumn chill, and lose myself in the rhythm of the place. Ruth was finalizing plans for the new building, her sketches now pinned to a bulletin board marked with notes from all of us. I'd trace my fingers over the lines, a classroom here, a garden there, picturing the women who'd find refuge in those walls. It wasn't just about the money I'd given, it was about the belief behind it, the faith that we as older women weren't finished, weren't invisible. Every time I helped with a task sorting donations, teaching my knitting class, or just listening to someone's story, I felt that faith grow stronger. Clara from my knitting group became a close friend. She was 70 with a laugh that could light up a room and a sadness in her eyes that mirrored my own. Her son had cut her off years ago, and she'd learned to carry that loss with a grace I admired. One afternoon as we sat knitting, she said, "Evelyn, you've got a fire in you now. I saw it the day you told Ruth about that donation. You're not just giving money, you're giving us hope." I blushed my needles, pausing, and said, "I just did what felt right." She shook her head, smiling. "No, you did what most of us dream of. You chose yourself." Her words stayed with me, a quiet validation that I wasn't wrong to redirect the trust fund to build something new from the ashes of my family's neglect. At home, I kept tending to my own growth. I painted more of my canvases, growing bolder with swirls of blue and gold that felt like the lake at sunrise. I'd hang them on my walls, not caring if they were good by anyone else's standards. They were mine, and that was enough. I also started gardening again, something I hadn't done since James and I lived in our old house. My apartment had a small balcony just big enough for a few pots. I planted herbs, basil, rosemary, thyme, and a single rose bush, its buds a soft pink that reminded me of my mother's garden. I'd water them each morning, my hands in the soil, feeling connected to something bigger than myself. James's watch would tick softly, grounding me, reminding me that time was still mine to shape. I also started reading again, not just the cozy mysteries I'd loved for years, but books about women who'd started over, memoirs, mostly by women my age, who'd faced loss and found their way. I'd underline passages, scribble notes in the margins, and feel a kinship with these strangers who'd learned, like me, that worth doesn't come from others' approval. One night I read a line that stopped me cold. "You don't need permission to live your own life." I wrote it on a slip of paper and taped it to my mirror where I'd see it every morning. It wasn't about rejecting my family, it was about embracing myself. The Haven's fundraiser was coming up, a big event to celebrate the new building and raise extra funds for programs. Ruth asked me to speak just a few words about why the Haven mattered. I hesitated, my old fear of being seen creeping back. "I'm not a speaker, Ruth," I said, my voice small. She looked at me, her eyes steady. "You don't need to be. Just tell your truth, Evelyn. That's enough." I agreed, my stomach nodding, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. Not after everything I'd done, everything I'd become. I spent days writing my speech, scratching out words, starting over, trying to capture what the Haven meant without making it about me. I didn't mention the trust fund, didn't want to. It wasn't about the money. It was about the women, the community, the second chance we'd all found. I practiced in front of my mirror, James's watch, glinting my voice, shaky, but growing stronger. "I'm Evelyn, and I found myself here." I'd say, imagining the faces in the crowd, hoping they'd feel what I felt. The night before the fundraiser, I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with fear and hope. I sat by my rose bush, the night air cool, and whispered to James, "I'm doing this for us, for me." His watch ticked, and I felt him there, steady as ever. The fundraiser was held in a community hall, the room packed with women from the Haven local donors, even a few reporters. I wore my green coat over a simple dress, James's watch heavy on my wrist, and stood in the back, my note cards damp from my nervous hands. Ruth spoke first, her voice warm and commanding, telling the story of the Haven's work. Then she called my name. My heart pounded, but I walked to the podium, my steps slow but sure. I looked out at the crowd, Clara smiling, Maria nodding, Ruth's eyes shining, and took a breath. "I'm Evelyn," I said, my voice trembling at first. "I came to the Haven because I felt invisible. I'd given everything to my family, and they didn't see me anymore. But here I found women who did, women who reminded me that I'm enough just as I am. This place isn't just a building. It's a home for every woman who's been told she's too old, too quiet, too much. It's where we start again." My voice grew stronger, the words flowing like water. "I'm here because of you, because of us, and I'm so grateful to be part of this." I stepped back, my hands shaking, and the room erupted in applause. Clara hugged me, tears in her eyes, and Ruth whispered, "You did it, Evelyn. You shone." I went home that night, my heart full, and slept deeper than I had in years. The next morning, I woke to a voicemail from Thomas. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Mom, I saw the article about the fundraiser. I didn't know. Can we talk?" I listened, my finger hovering over the delete button, but I didn't press it. I wasn't ready to answer, not yet. I needed time to sit with what I'd done, what I'd said. I'd spoken my truth to a room full of strangers, and it had set me free in a way I hadn't expected. Whatever Thomas wanted, it could wait. I was Evelyn, and I was enough. I went to the Haven that day, my rose bush's first bud tucked into my coat pocket as a reminder of growth. Ruth showed me the latest plans for the building, now fully funded with a groundbreaking set for spring. We walked the empty lot where it would stand, the grass brittle under our feet, and I pictured it. The walls, the windows, the women who'd fill it. I didn't need my family's approval to know it was right. I didn't need their regret to feel whole. I had myself, my community, my truth. And that was more than I'd ever dreamed of. The morning after the fundraiser, I woke with a quiet strength that felt like it had been there all along, waiting for me to claim it. I was 68, and I'd stood in front of a room full of people, my voice carrying the weight of my truth. I told them about the women's haven, about finding myself when I thought I was lost, and they'd listen not out of pity, but with respect. The applause still echoed in my mind, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that I wasn't invisible. Not anymore. Thomas's voicemail, left unanswered on my phone, was a faint shadow compared to that light. I wasn't ready to face him, not because I was afraid, but because I was still savoring the woman I'd become. I went to the lake that morning, my thermos of tea warm in my hands, my green coat bright against the gray November sky. The water was still reflecting the bare trees like a painting, and I sat on my bench. James's watch ticking softly. I didn't talk to him this time, didn't need to. I just breathed, letting the cold air fill my lungs, feeling the pulse of my own life. The rosebud I'd tucked into my pocket the day before was still there, its pink petals soft but resilient. I held it smiling and thought of my balcony garden, of the Haven's new building, of all the small things I'd planted that were starting to bloom. The Women's Haven was buzzing when I arrived later that day. The fundraiser had brought in more than we'd hoped, and Ruth was already planning the groundbreaking ceremony. She'd framed the article from the local paper, the one that mentioned the James Hartley Fund, and hung it on the wall. I blushed when I saw it, my heart swelling at James's name in bold print. "You should be proud," Evelyn Ruth said, her eyes twinkling. "This is your legacy, too." I shook my head, deflecting like I always did. "It's ours," I said, and she hugged me, her arms strong and sure. I threw myself into the Haven's work, not to hide from Thomas's voicemail, but because it felt right. I taught my knitting class, laughing with Clara and the others as we untangled yarn and shared stories. I helped Ruth with the budget, my old bookkeeping skills sharper than I'd expected. I even started a new project collecting stories from the women, little snippets of their lives to display in the new building. Maria told me about her first job as a seamstress, her hands flying as she described the dresses she'd made. Linda shared how she'd gone back to school at 55, her voice fierce with pride. Each story was a thread weaving us together, and I felt honored to hold them. At home, I kept nurturing my own space. I painted another canvas, this one, a bold swirl of green and gold like my coat against the lake's dawn. I hung it above my desk where I'd started writing more than letters to myself, notes for a memoir maybe, or just a record of this season of my life. I'd write in the evenings, Ella Fitzgerald's voice soft in the background, my words flowing like water. "Dear Evelyn, you are not what they took from you. You are what you've built." I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but it wasn't for them. It was for me, a map of where I'd been and where I was going. My balcony garden grew too. The rose bush bloomed its pink flowers, defiant against the cold. I'd sit out there sometimes, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea and watching the stars. I'd think about James, about the dreams we'd had: a little house by the lake, a scholarship for kids who couldn't afford college, a life full of love. We'd gotten some of it, not all, but I was carrying it forward now. The James Hartley Fund was part of that, but so was I. Evelyn, whole and alive, not just a widow or a mother or a grandmother, but a woman with a story worth telling. Thomas called again a week later, his voice softer this time. "Mom, please. I just want to talk." I let it go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I needed space. I wasn't the same Evelyn he'd known, the one who'd shrink to fit his life. I'd grown, and I wasn't sure he was ready to see that. But the calls kept coming, Thomas, then Sophie, even Laura, once her voice clipped, but less sharp. I listened to each one, my heart aching but firm. I'd talk to them when I was ready, not because they demanded it. Then one evening, Sophie showed up at my door. I was in the middle of painting my hands smudged with green when the knock came. She stood there, her eyes red, her coat pulled tight against the cold. "Grandma," she said, her voice breaking. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, my heart caught between the hurt of her words and the love I still carried for her. But I nodded, stepping aside. She sat on my couch, her hands twisting, and I waited silent, letting her find her words. "I'm so sorry," she said, finally, tears spilling over. "What I said at the party, I didn't mean it, not really. I was just showing off, I guess. I didn't know how much it would hurt you." She looked at me, her eyes searching for forgiveness, but I didn't rush to give it. "Sophie," I said, my voice steady, "you laughed because you thought I didn't matter. That's what hurt. Not just the words, but what they meant." She sobbed, her shoulders shaking, and I felt a pang, but I didn't soften. Not yet. I told her about the Haven, about the women I'd met, the building we were creating. I didn't mention the trust fund, didn't need to. "I found a place where I'm seen," I said. "Not as a burden, but as Evelyn. That's what I needed, and I don't think you understood that until now." She nodded, her face crumpling. "I want to fix this, Grandma. I don't know how, but I want to try. I looked at her, my granddaughter, and saw the girl I'd loved, but also the woman who'd hurt me. It's not about fixing it, Sophie, I said. It's about learning to see people really see them before it's too late. She stayed for an hour drinking tea, looking at my paintings. She noticed the rose bush on the balcony, the bookmark Clara had made the life I'd built without her. When she left, she hugged me, her arms tight, and I hugged her back. But it wasn't the same. It was a start, maybe, but not a return to what was. I closed the door, my heart heavy but not broken. I'd given her truth, not absolution, and that was enough for now. The next day, I went to the Haven where Ruth was planning the groundbreaking. She'd invited me to speak again this time to a smaller group donors volunteers, the women who'd made it possible. I agreed not because I wanted the spotlight, but because I wanted to honor what we'd done. I wrote my speech at my desk, the rosebud pressed into a book beside me, James's watch ticking. I'm Evelyn, and this is our story. I wasn't nervous this time, not like before. I was ready. The groundbreaking was set for a cold morning in early December, the lot where the new building would stand marked with ribbons and stakes. I stood with Clara Maria and the others, my green coat bright. My speech folded in my pocket. Ruth spoke first, her voice carrying over the wind, and then it was my turn. I stepped forward, my breath visible in the air, and looked at the faces around me, women I'd laughed with, cried with, grown with. I'm Evelyn, I said, my voice clear. This place saved me, not because it gave me a roof, but because it gave me a mirror. It showed me who I am, a woman with a heart, a story, a purpose. The James Hartley Fund is for all of us, for every woman who's been told she's not enough. We're here to say we are. The crowd clapped their faces glowing, and I stepped back, my heart full. Clara squeezed my hand, whispering, "You're a force, Evelyn." I smiled, feeling it, knowing it. I didn't know if my family would hear about this, if they'd care. Thomas's voicemails were still unanswered, Sophie's visit still a fragile thread. But I didn't need their validation. I had the Haven, my paintings, my garden, my truth. I was Evelyn, and I was enough. The rosebud in my book, the watch on my wrist, the women beside me, they were my legacy, and I was at peace with that. The groundbreaking ceremony left me with a glow that lingered like the warmth of a fire you can still feel hours after it's gone out. I was 68, and I'd stood on that cold December morning, my voice steady, telling a crowd of strangers and friends that I was enough. The words weren't just for them, they were for me, carved deep into my heart after years of feeling like a ghost in my own family. The Women's Haven, the James Hartley Fund. The rosebud pressed in my book, they were proof of a life I'd reclaimed, not with fanfare, but with quiet, relentless love for myself. My family's silence punctuated only by Thomas's unanswered voicemails, and Sophie's tearful visit no longer defined me. I was Evelyn, and I was whole. The weeks that followed were busy, the Haven humming with plans for the new building. I'd show up most days, my green coat now a familiar sight, and dive into whatever needed doing, sorting donations, planning classes, or just sitting with Ruth over coffee, dreaming up the future. The women started calling me the heart of the place, a nickname that made me blush, but secretly warmed me. Clara, my knitting friend, would tease Evelyn, "You're going to have to start charging for all this wisdom you're dishing out." I'd laugh, shaking my head, but her words stayed with me, a reminder that I had something to give, something that mattered. At home, I kept tending my small world. My balcony garden flourished despite the winter chill, the rose bushes' pink blooms defiant against the frost. I'd wrap myself in a blanket and sit out there sipping tea, watching the city lights flicker like stars. My paintings grew bolder canvases of deep blues and fiery reds that felt like my soul spilling out. I'd write in my notebook, not just letters to myself now, but stories, memories of James. Moments from the Haven glimpses of the girl I'd been before life taught me to shrink. Dear Evelyn, you are a story worth telling. I didn't know if I'd ever share them, but writing them felt like planting seeds, each one a promise to the future. I also started taking better care of myself, not out of duty, but out of joy. I'd walk by the lake every morning, my breath puffing in the cold James's watch, ticking like a heartbeat. I joined a cooking class at the Haven, learning to make dishes. I'd never tried spicy Thai noodles, rich chocolate tarts, laughing with Maria and Linda as we fumbled with ingredients. My body felt stronger, not just from yoga or walks, but from the way I carried myself now, shoulders back, eyes forward. I'd catch my reflection in shop windows, a silver-haired woman in a green coat, and think, that's me, that's Evelyn. My family's absence was still there, a dull ache I didn't try to ignore. Thomas's voicemails had stopped, and Sophie hadn't reached out since her visit. Laura's social media posts, which I glanced at once out of habit, showed their lives moving on Sophie's wedding plans. Thomas's new car smiles that didn't include me. I didn't resent them, not anymore. I just saw them clearly, maybe for the first time. They'd built a world where I was an afterthought, and I'd built one where I was the center. I didn't need their regret to feel complete, but I wondered if they'd ever understand what they'd lost. Then one afternoon in late January, everything shifted. I was at the Haven helping Ruth sort through thank you notes from donors when my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Grayson, my lawyer, his voice calm but urgent. Evelyn, we need to meet. It's about the trust fund. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with a strange certainty. I knew this moment was coming, had felt it building since Thomas's first call. What's happened? I asked, my voice steady. He paused, then said, Your family's contesting the transfer. They've hired a lawyer. Can you come to my office tomorrow? I agreed, my heart racing but my mind clear. I thanked him, hung up and sat there. Ruth's concerned eyes on me. They're fighting it. I told her, my voice quiet. The trust fund. They want it back. Ruth reached for my hand, her grip firm. Evelyn, you did nothing wrong. That money was yours to give, and you gave it to something beautiful. Don't let them make you doubt that. I nodded her words, grounding me. But as I drove home, the weight of it settled in. Thomas, Laura, Sophie. They weren't just hurt. They were angry, ready to drag this into a courtroom. I pictured their faces, the accusations in their eyes, and felt a flicker of the old Evelyn, the one who'd shrink to keep the peace. But she was gone, replaced by a woman who'd spoken her truth to a crowd, who'd built a legacy with her own hands. That night I sat by my rosebush, the winter air sharp, and wrote in my notebook, Dear Evelyn, they can fight for the money, but they can't take your dignity. You are enough. I read it over my fingers, tracing the words, and felt James's watch tick against my wrist. I wasn't fighting for the trust fund. I was fighting for myself, for the Haven, for every woman who'd ever been told she was less. I called Mr. Grayson back, my voice firm. Do what you need to, I said. I'm not backing down. He promised to handle it, his tone warm with respect, and I hung up, my heart steady. The meeting was set for the next morning, but I didn't tell anyone at the Haven, not yet. I wanted to face this alone, not because I was ashamed, but because it was mine to carry. I wore my green coat, James's watch, and a simple dress, my hair pinned up the way I used to when I felt strong. Mr. Grayson's office was small, the air thick with the smell of coffee and old books. Thomas, Laura, and Sophie were already there, their faces tight, a lawyer beside them, a young man with sharp eyes, and a briefcase. I sat across from them, my hands folded, my eyes, meeting theirs without flinching. The lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth. Laying out their case, the trust fund was meant for Sophie. I'd acted impulsively. They deserved a say. I listened, my heart pounding, but my face calm. Mr. Grayson countered, his voice steady, explaining that the trust was mine to direct, that I'd followed every legal step. Then it was my turn. I looked at my family, their eyes a mix of anger and expectation, and spoke. "I didn't take anything from you," I said, my voice clear. "That money was mine and James's built from years of sacrifice. I gave it to the Women's Haven because they saw me when you didn't. Sophie, you said I was only invited to your party to be polite. Thomas Laura, you let me feel like a burden. I didn't give the money away to punish you. I gave it to women who needed it. Women who reminded me I'm not invisible. I chose to honor myself and James's memory. You can fight this, but you won't change what I've done." The room was silent, the air heavy. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling. Thomas looked down, his jaw tight. Laura's face hardened, but she didn't speak. Their lawyer murmured something about reviewing options, but I could feel the shift. They'd expected me to crumble, to apologize, to beg for their forgiveness. But I wasn't that Evelyn anymore. I was the woman who'd stood on a stage, who'd planted a rose bush, who'd built a legacy. Mr. Grayson squeezed my arm as we left, whispering, "You were remarkable, Evelyn." I smiled, my heart full, and walked out into the cold, my green coat bright against the gray. I went to the Haven afterward, needing the warmth of the women there. Ruth knew something was wrong the moment she saw me, and I told her everything: the meeting, the lawyer, my family's anger. She hugged me, her voice fierce. "You stood your ground, Evelyn. That's what matters." Clara and Maria joined us, their hands on mine, their stories weaving around me like a shield. I didn't know what my family would do next, if they'd push the fight further or let it go. But I wasn't afraid. I'd spoken my truth, not just to them, but to myself, and it had set me free. That night, I sat by my balcony, the rose bushes' blooms glowing under the moonlight. I held James's watch, its tick a steady rhythm, and felt him with me. I didn't need to win a legal battle to know I'd won something greater: my dignity, my purpose, my life. I was Evelyn, and I was enough. Whatever came next, I'd face it with my head high, my heart open, and my roots deep in the ground I'd claimed as my own. The winter deepened, wrapping the world in a quiet that felt both heavy and holy. I was 68, and I'd faced my family in that lawyer's office, my voice steady as I told them why I'd given the trust fund to the Women's Haven. Their faces, Thomas's tight jaw, Laura's hardened eyes. Sophie's tearful silence stayed with me, not as a wound, but as a marker of how far I'd come. I wasn't the Evelyn who'd shrink to keep the peace, who'd beg for their love. I was the woman who'd planted a rosebush, spoken her truth to a crowd, and built a legacy that would outlive me. The fight over the trust fund wasn't over. Mr. Grayson warned me they might push further, but I wasn't afraid. I'd found my ground, and I was standing on it. The Women's Haven became my sanctuary more than ever. I'd walk through the door, my green coat dusted with snow, and feel the warmth of the women there, their laughter and stories a balm to the ache my family left behind. Ruth was busy with the new building's plans, the groundbreaking now a memory that glowed in all of us. She'd show me updates, blueprints, paint samples, even a sketch of the garden where my rosebush's cuttings would grow. "This is yours too, Evelyn," she'd say, her eyes soft. I'd shake my head smiling, but I felt it the weight and joy of being part of something bigger than myself. Clara and I grew closer, our knitting sessions turning into long talks over tea. She'd lost her son to distance and pride like I had, and we'd share the pain of it, not to dwell, but to let it breathe. "You're different now, Evelyn," she said one day, her needles pausing. "You've got a light in you, like you know who you are." I blushed, thinking of the rosebud pressed in my book, the paintings on my walls, the words I'd written to myself. "I'm learning," I said, and she nodded her smile, saying she understood. At home, I kept building my life's small acts that felt like prayers. I painted every week my canvases, now full of color deep purples, bright yellows, colors I'd once thought too bold for me. I'd hang them up, not caring if they were art, just proud they were mine. My balcony garden held strong, the rosebush blooming even in the cold, its pink petals a promise of spring. I'd sit out there, wrapped in a blanket, James's watch ticking, and write in my notebook. Dear Evelyn, you are not what they took from you. You are what you've chosen to become. The words weren't just for me anymore. They were for every woman I'd met at the Haven, every story I'd collected, every heart that had found its way back. I started reaching out beyond the Haven, too. I joined a book club at the library where women my age debated novels and shared wine, their laughter pulling me into their circle. I took a pottery class, my hands clumsy in the clay, but happy shaping bowls that wobbled but held. I even volunteered at a local shelter, serving meals to people who looked at me with gratitude, not pity. Each step was a thread weaving me into a world that saw me not as a grandmother or a widow, but as Evelyn, whole and alive. My family's fight over the trust fund simmered in the background. Mr. Grayson kept me updated, his voice calm as he explained their lawyer's latest moves, letters, demands, threats of a lawsuit. They don't have a strong case, he said, but they're trying to wear you down. I nodded, my heart steady. Let them try, I said, and meant it. I wasn't fighting for the money. I was fighting for the Haven, for the women who'd find refuge there, for the legacy James and I had dreamed of. I'd given the trust fund freely, not out of anger, but out of love, and no lawyer could take that away. Then one snowy February morning, it all came to a head. I was at home sipping tea by my rosebush when Mr. Grayson called. Evelyn, they've dropped it, he said, his voice bright. Your family's lawyer just notified me they're not pursuing the trust fund anymore. I sat there, the phone heavy in my hand, snow falling softly outside. Why, I asked, not sure I wanted the answer. He hesitated, then said, I don't know the details, but I suspect they realized they couldn't win. Or maybe they heard you. I thanked him, my voice thick, and hung up my heart, a tangle of relief, and something softer like forgiveness, but not quite. I went to the Haven that day, needing the women there, their strength and warmth. I told Ruth and Clara, my voice trembling, and they hugged me, their cheers filling the room. You did it, Evelyn, Ruth said, her eyes shining. You stood tall and they backed down. I smiled, feeling the truth of it, but I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a woman who'd chosen herself, who'd honored her heart, and that was enough. A week later, Sophie called. Her voice was small, hesitant, like she wasn't sure I'd answer. Grandma, can I see you? She asked. I paused, remembering her tears, her laughter at the engagement party, the years of love I'd poured into her. Come over, I said, not because I owed her, but because I was ready. She arrived that evening, snow in her hair, her eyes searching mine. We sat on my couch, tea steaming between us, and she spoke. I read about the Haven, she said, her voice breaking, about what you did, what it means. I didn't understand before. I was selfish, Grandma. I thought the money was mine, but it was yours, and you gave it to something so much bigger. She cried, her hands twisting, and I listened, my heart open but firm. I'm so sorry, she said. I want to be better. I want to know you really know you. I looked at her, my granddaughter, and saw not just the girl who'd hurt me, but the woman she might become. Sophie. I said, my voice gentle. I love you. I always will. But love doesn't mean ignoring pain. You hurt me, and I had to choose myself. I forgive you, but trust takes time. She nodded, tears falling, and reached for my hand. I let her hold it, feeling the weight of her regret, the possibility of something new. We talked for hours about the Haven, my paintings, the rosebush on my balcony. She listened, really listened, and when she left, she hugged me, her arms tight. I didn't know if we'd rebuild what we'd lost, but I was open to trying, not for her, but for me. Thomas and Laura reached out later, their apologies quieter, less certain. I met them for coffee, my green coat, bright James's watch, steady. They didn't ask for the trust fund, didn't push. Thomas said, I'm proud of you, Mom. His voice thick, and Laura nodded, her eyes down. I didn't need their pride, but I took it a small bridge across the distance. We'd never be the family I'd once dreamed of, but we could be something else, something honest if they chose to show up. Spring came, and the Haven's new building rose its walls strong, its windows catching the light. I was there for the opening, standing with Ruth, Clara, and the others, my rosebush's cuttings blooming in the garden. I didn't speak. This time. Didn't need to. I just stood, my heart full, watching women walk through the doors, their faces bright with hope. I thought of James, of the dreams we'd shared, and felt him in the breeze, the tick of his watch, the pink roses swaying. That evening I went to the lake, my thermos of tea, warm, my green coat folded beside me. I took the rosebud from my book, now dried and fragile, and set it on the water, watching it drift. It wasn't a goodbye, but a thank you to James, to the Haven, to myself. I'd been betrayed, neglected, laughed at, but I'd risen, not with anger, but with dignity. I was Evelyn, and I was enough. I looked at the stars, my voice soft. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, I said to myself, to you, to every woman listening. It's by how you choose to honor yourself. I stood, my watch ticking, and walked home, my heart at peace, my life my own.